Those are the two that are next in line. So any preference of one or the other?
Red cap database.
Red cap, okay, sure. So, let me see if I can put it here.
This one office in April. Yeah. Did you see the blurb thing?
Yeah.
I don't, and you guys might want to reevaluate how you do that going forward, because like we had started it where the office fellow and the ultrasound fellow for that block is responsible for any blurbs, but I think what's happened is like, since we don't go over blurbs every block, it's very like, you can look at the spreadsheet, I've literally presented like every blurb.
Yeah.
Which is fine, and I'll do it again in April, I don't care, but I'm just saying for going forward, when you guys plan, I think you're setting yourself up for it not being even between people. And so I wonder if like just saying each fellow is responsible on the days that blurbs are done, each fellow is responsible for coming forward with one or two blurbs. And then instead of having it like, because I made that up, I just thought it made sense if we were going to be doing blurbs for like the ultrasound and the office fellow to be in charge of it for that month. But when we're not doing them every month, it doesn't
Makes sense.
Okay, so we'll go over introduction to Red Cap, and I'm gonna go in and out of the PowerPoint and actual Red Cap so you guys can see. So, just for getting started, Red Cap is like research, education, design, capture, or database capture. It is an online source that is hosted by multiple institutions across the country, and Jefferson hosts a Red Cap server as well. So Jefferson has its own Red Cap server. The reason I mention this is if you're working with people at other institutions, they might say, oh, I use Red Cap too. It's not like all connected. Each institution hosts its own Red Cap server. You would need your own username and password for any individual Red Cap server. That includes people who you're collaborating with, who you want to have included on your Red Cap database. So you have to go to redcap.jefferson.edu. Your login is your Jefferson username and password, but you do need to activate an account, which is just like you submit a request and within 24 hours it's activated. And then the other—
You're not sharing.
Oh, okay. Oops, sorry. Thank you. Is this— yeah, this is on Zoom. Okay, let me do share. Oh, sorry, I have to sign in to here. Give me 1 second. Oh, it's right here. Share. That good?
Yes, great.
And then the other thing is you also, and this is just for your personal timing, you can't like do this all the night before, because when you're creating a database, you also have to submit a request to create a new project. And they ask for the IRB number, although I don't know if anyone's like really looking at it. I've started databases before I've had the IRB number. But it does, again, it is another thing that takes 24 hours usually for them to approve the database that you've chosen to create. So, and the first thing that you need to do for getting started with Red Cap, once you have a project set up, the first screen that you're going to be at is the tab that's called Project Setup, and this determines sort of how your entire database is going to be structured. So if you're going to be using surveys, and that is specifically surveys that you want to be distributed through RedCap. So for example, if you're having someone, if you're doing like a questionnaire in the office that you're handing out by print, or you're personally asking them these questions, then you don't need to activate the survey module. But if you are doing a project where you are emailing out a survey, once or every 3 months, then you want to activate that survey form. The other thing that you want to establish is whether you're going to do longitudinal data collection. And what that means, and that's, again, something that you can, it kind of saves you the trouble of having to create multiple instruments for the same data collection. So if you're collecting the same kinds of data over 3 different time points, rather than having to recreate the same thing 3 times, you can actually say there's going to be 3 time points in this data set, and I will, and these are the instruments that I'll be using for each time point. And I'll show you how to do that. These you need to do in advance. It can get tricky after the fact if you're trying to change the type of project setup that you have after you've already started. And the next area is your instrument collection. So again, you don't need to have multiple instruments. You could have all of your data collected in one thing. The reason I like multiple instruments for data collection is, well, there's multiple reasons. First is I have, instruments you can download these kind of blueprints essentially of instruments and reuse them in multiple studies. So I have a general demographic OBGYN instrument, and that I use in every database, regardless of what I'm doing. I'm always collecting maternal age, EDD, gestational, parity, and term deliveries, and certain maternal history. I'm always collecting hypertension, diabetes, etc. And so I have a separate instrument for that, because regardless of what study I'm doing, I always upload that. And then I can tweak it if there's specific things for a specific database. So one benefit is it allows you to easily use the same data collection tool in multiple databases without having to spend 30 minutes making it all over again from scratch. The other nice thing for instruments is that having separate instruments is important if you are doing a longitudinal study, because then you'll say at this time point, I'm using these data points as what I'm collecting. For example, demographic and OBGYN history, you're only going to collect that once. Blood pressure through pregnancy, you might be collecting that, or glucose control through pregnancy, you might be collecting that at multiple time points. And so when you're doing something longitudinal, and again, I'll show you how to do that, but you designate which data collection tools, or which are called instruments, you're going to be doing at each time point in your visit. The other important thing with instruments is that it allows you to personalize which users have access to which data. So, for example, let's say you want to make sure that someone is blinded to something. So let's say part of your data collection is like placental pathology, but you don't want the person who's documenting placental pathology to know what was the delivery outcomes. So they might just have the study ID and then access to this one instrument, which is entering the placental pathology. And so that makes sure, that's a way sort of saying like, well, basically blinding your outcome assessor. So they don't know what the pregnancy outcome was, which may then bias how they're interpreting that placental pathology. So, or you might have, for example, you might have PHI in a specific instrument because you need to be able to track, long-term, whatever you want to keep track of the MRN, but you don't want to obviously have that accessible to multiple people. And so maybe only you have access to the instrument that has PHI, and everything else is, otherwise other people have access to. So, and then the final thing that instruments are helpful for is when you're creating data reports. If you don't want to see everything all at once, but you just want to see, the demographics and the outcomes, then you can select those are just the things that I want to see in this export report. Again, it just makes it easier to select what kind of data you're collecting, importing, exporting. And again, you don't have to do this. You could also do this manually. If you had only one instrument, you can manually select each field that someone has access to, et cetera. But obviously that's a lot of work to do that. So I really like using instruments. And then also, if you are doing any kind of study, please, and you want to look at these, like, please let me know. You can look at, you can, like I said, I can share this instrument file and you just upload that to your database and then you can edit it as you see fit. But again, it just keeps you from having to recreate 20 variables and variable names. In creating an instrument, so when you go to data collection instruments, you can either create a new instrument from scratch, or you can upload an instrument zip. So this is what I was talking about. So, I have all of these instrument names here. I can download those as a zip file, email it to you, and then you can upload that zip file. And again, then it's imported into your database and you can edit it. It doesn't change anything about my instrument, but it just keeps you from having to reinvent the wheel, and then you can adjust it and add specific fields that are necessary for your project. REDCap also has an instrument library you can explore. I haven't personally used it, but I'm sure it probably has a lot of things by now, including pregnancy-related instruments. Also, NICHD has some REDCap instruments that you can use. They had a number of them related to COVID-19 work. I will say their data instruments have a lot of fields, and I had to use one because I was doing COVID-19 research with the NICHD. So it was not something that I think use for most of the projects that you guys are doing. It was like a lot of extra fields, and I collected that data because that's what was asked, but it's a lot of data that I wouldn't otherwise use, a lot of social and economic data that we don't routinely collect, and you might not be even have access to it in a retrospective chart review. But again, just to know that those tools are out there so that you're not recreating individual variables all on your own. So when you're creating a variable, this is what it looks like. So you have to say, what is the field type? There's different types of field types. And you can, depending on the field type, you have to obviously pick your variable name, but you can also pick a validation. So if you're doing a date, your field type would be text box, which is that means it's like a free entry. But for validation, you can say what type of date you want it to be entered. You should always do this for date fields because you want to make sure that people entering your study data are entering dates the same way. Also, all your dates should be coded in the same way: month, day, year, day, month, year, month, day, year, year. It doesn't matter what you use, they should all be the same, because you will not be able to do any kind of date-related calculations if they are coded differently. And so it's very, very important to select a validation format for your date and that you're using the same format for all dates in your entire database. There's a lot of different type of field types to choose from. So short box, you can do multiple choice with a drop-down list, which is a single answer. That means they have to click a button and a drop-down comes up. You can do a radio button. That means all the options are visible. You don't have to click anything, but you can only select one of those. You can also do check boxes, which is multiple answers. So for example, for race, you might do check boxes because people might select multiple races that they identify with. For antenatal complications, you might do multiple check boxes rather than have individual yes, no answers. There's pluses and minuses to both of those things, and we can go over that.
Calculated fields. Do you have recs for that?
Yes, and we can go through that in a second. I'm just gonna go through this, and then we're gonna actually open REDCap and go through everything kind of again within REDCap. Yes, no fields. That just is. There's nothing special about that. It just automatically makes something. One is yes. You can see 0 is no. The downside of doing a yes, no field is that you don't have the option for unknown or missing, which if you are doing data collection, you want to know, was this missing because no one did it? Or was this missing because, like that chart wasn't reviewed yet, et cetera? Or was it missing because the chart was reviewed and that information is missing? And so you may or may not want to use yes, no, if you want to make sure that you have, missing or unknown as a specific option that you want to do. You can also do consent forms through REDCap. I'm not going to go over that now, but Jefferson has templates for consent forms as well, in which case there's signature boxes you can add where they can sign sort of online. Also great is file upload. So if you want, so if, for example, your database will include images. So for example, we did a study with pupil dilation. So we took a picture of the eyes and that was uploaded into REDCap. If you want to upload PDFs of some kind, you can include that as a option for upload. Slider and visual analog scale is also another option, great for surveys. Again, it just pre-fills this kind of slider option. You fill in what the kind of scale is that you want, and then that will be done. And then the begin new section is really just for the appearance. So it's basically just a title or a header to help break up your survey or your tool instrument, whether it's a survey or not. When you're doing multiple options, an important thing is, so if you just write them all down without putting the numbers next to it, REDCap will automatically assign numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in ascending order. I always manually put the choices in because I always have as my other or unknown to be 9 and 99. So that if while I'm doing my data collection, I realize like, oh, actually, I didn't think of this, but this is coming up often, I'm going to add this as an option. And so I always do like 1, 2, 3, and then I'll put other as 9 or unknown as 9, 99. Or none, for example, is 9 or 99. And that way, like, just so it's not like you have medical condition, none. Oh, I forgot this medical condition, so it just keeps it at, so that kind of last choice will always be at the bottom. So that's why I always number it manually, but again, you don't have to. The other thing you can do in designing your variable is you can say that something is an identifier. So if this is a patient identifier, a PHI, you click yes. And again, when you're doing a data download, there's an option to export data excluding any PHI. So it'll exclude any identifiers automatically. And again, with user access, if only you want to have access to that PHI and you don't want anyone else, they're doing data, but they don't need to know this information. Again, it allows you to do that. Another important thing here in the variable design is validation. Again, strongly recommend doing this when you're having other people, well, even for yourself, but especially if you're having other people enter your data. It's an easy way to avoid an error in data entry. So for example, maternal age, it will be between 15 and 55. It doesn't mean that you can't enter something that's 13, but it does mean if someone enters 13, a box will pop up and say, this is outside the range, are you sure? Or you can just make your range like 13 to 55, well, maybe 65, but it keeps you from having someone enter it at 3 when it should have been 30. You can say something should be a whole number and not a fraction. Again, and also this is also where you would put your date formatting. That's another form of validation. So this validation, if you open it, it's like integer, date, whatever, and then you can have minimums and maximums. Same things for dates. You can also have minimums and maximums. So for example, if your study is like you're collecting data from 2020 to 2025, you can say the minimum date would be 1/1/2020, for example. And again, it's just a quality check to help avoid issues with where you're going back and being like, I just did all this analysis and I realized this one point was wrong, and so I have to redo everything. The other thing that's really good is required. So this is really good to make sure that some of your key data points are not missed. And so that if someone tries to skip over, it'll say this is a required field. Oh, you forgot to put in the due date, estimate the gestation, like the date of delivery, required field. That's my primary outcome. So it's a great way to avoid accidentally missing key data points. And again, it doesn't keep you from doing it, but it will just, again, flag that person, like you forgot to enter this required information. The calculated field is great. I love calculated fields to avoid errors. And so one of the things that I often do, so you can, if you have someone's date of birth there, you can make sure that every study visit has a calculated age, because that's just going to be study visit minus the date of birth. What I use it most often for is gestational age. So you have someone's EDD there, and you then have a calculated field for date versus EDD and what the gestational age is for that date. So that could be calculating gestational age of delivery. It could be calculating gestational age of an ultrasound, whatever it is. Same thing with BMI. So if BMI isn't always documented, you can have height and weight and have a calculated field for BMI so that will automatically calculate that for you. REDCap does a really, they have this option for how do I format the equation. And so it will tell you how to do, if you're trying to do a date calculation, division between variables, addition, multiplication, whatever. It really makes it easy as a how-to for creating those formulas. And again, it's just a great way of avoiding error, I think, especially for the key things like gestational age at delivery. And so, it's just it's another checkpoint there. So this is, again, and if you get my instruments, you'll be able to see this, but you can see gestational age at delivery is my calculated field. So this is the calculation for it. And it looks complicated, but actually, and I'll show you this, when you go to calculate equation, you just kind of fill in it tells you like what to write and where you fill in the variables. So round is meaning I'm going to round this to 1 decimal point. So date difference between EDD and date of delivery. And then this is telling me the format of, so I want that result in days. So that's the D for days. The format of my date variable is month, day, year. True is based on how you're rounding, meaning that you're going to do regular rounding. And then I'm dividing this by 7. So this is the days between date of delivery and EDD. Divided by 7 is weeks, and then plus 40 will give you your actual gestational age at delivery. So for example, if your date of delivery is your EDD is April 22nd, and your date of delivery is April 15th, then that difference is 7 days divided by 7 is 1, and then, plus 40 is 41, so that's when you deliver. As far as what instruments to create, if you're doing any kind of prospective study, you should definitely have a screening and enrollment form anytime you're trying to publish for something that you're prospectively enrolling for. Any major journal will ask you how many people were eligible, how many people were approached, how many people were screened in or screened out, and then of those people who screened in, who declined versus not. So name and date of screen, eligible, yes or no. So you can have your inclusion and exclusion criteria, it's yes or no. And I'll actually show you when you can make basically a box to do this. Consented, yes or no. And then if they consented, date and time of consent, and then randomized yes or no, right? For some people, you randomize at the time of consent. For some people, you consent them, and then they have to meet certain criteria, and then they'll be randomized. So there's 2 different steps there. And then some people might consent, and then 2 days later decide they don't want to, and you haven't randomized them. So both those things are important. So this is an example of you can make a chart basically, and so this is an example of exclusion criteria or a chart for yes or no. So you don't have to, and again, I'll show you how to make this kind of table so that you're not creating each individual yes, no variable. You basically just say, these are all the things that are yes, no questions, and it'll make you a table like this. And that's an easy way, again, to track your inclusion and exclusion. Consents to study, and then, and you can also do things where it's branching logic. So for example, this ability to consent to study will only appear if all of these answers are no, right? You don't have to do that, but it's something that you can do. And so see over here, like branching logic. So you could have branching logic here where this only appear if these are all yes. Over here, date of consent is only appearing if consent to study is yes. So again, it just keeps things from getting messy. And again, data is only entered when appropriate. These are like things to include, like if you're thinking about, well, you know, how much detail do I need to include for demographics? You always need to include race and ethnicity, age, BMI. Those are basic demographic variables that everyone will be asking for. Parity is a pretty common one for any pregnancy related study. In general, I think the basics of obstetric history to complete, even if it's just yes or no, is whether someone's had a prior preterm delivery, a prior full-term delivery, or if they're nulliparous. And if you don't want to collect the full G's and P's, you can just do a yes or no for that. I would pick 1 to 3 relevant social history. You know, there's like 20 different things you could collect on social history. Just think about what are you going to be reporting in your paper, what is going to be important for you to know in analysis, so potential confounders, for example. 3 to 5 relevant medical history. Again, you could collect a lot of different medical history, but you know, whether or not someone's hypothyroid may not be relevant to, you know, your study about, you know, like fetal diaphragmatic hernia, right? And so just be conscious. You don't want to collect too little, obviously, you don't have to go back, but be conscious of what's actually going to be relevant and reported to minimize the amount of work that you're doing in collecting data. And also think about what is routinely reported or consistently collected. So if you're doing a retrospective study on chart review, and you know, like, you know what, we don't routinely ask about a family history of XYZ, then maybe that's not something you want to include because you know that's not going to be a reliable marker. I will say a good example of this is marital status. So I don't trust Epic's, you know, description of someone's marital status. If they're married, that's generally accurate. But I've seen many times where Epic has said that someone's single and they come in and say, this is my husband, you know? So it's just thinking about what you know you're going to be able to collect reliably. If you're doing something prospective, obviously you have no more freedom in collecting that data because you're actively asking about it. But think about what is accessible to you as well. Oh, sorry. This is like freezing up on me. Okay. So for outcomes, in general, obviously for, you know, obviously this is focused on pregnancy related work. So you want to be able to not just track, for anyone that for any kind of prospective work, you want to know if someone was lost to follow up, if they withdrew from your study. And then for any kind of pregnancy work where you're entering data from, you know, from a condition that's found earlier in pregnancy, you want to be tracking miscarriage, pregnancy termination, or fetal demise. I have found that it's helpful to have those as separate variables so that I'm not going back and saying like, okay, this was a 16-week delivery. Why was it 16 weeks? Was that a termination? Was that a miscarriage? You know, what was that classified as? Because that might change, you know, how you're reporting your results or whether that patient is included as an outcome or not. For example, you might say like, you know, you might exclude in your analysis anyone with a pregnancy termination, but not with a spontaneous preterm delivery at 20 weeks, you know, things like that. Or pregnancy termination for other indications, et cetera. Basic things to collect for any study relating to pregnancy would be gestational age at delivery and delivery mode, often regardless of what you're reporting on. Those are outcomes people expect to know about. And then similar to your medical history, pick relevant antenatal complications, you know, and things that you think, again, will be accurately collected. So for example, I did one of my cervical length studies. I was looking, one of my options was like vaginitis and pregnancy. And then I realized like, really to address that, you have to look through every progress note and look, you know, because they might have had vaginitis diagnosed somewhere else, not necessarily here, and look at their Epic labs and decide, you know what, this is like too much work to collect that information. And so I ended up not I took it out basically for future studies. So pick what's going to be relevant for you. Obviously, if something's relevant, don't not collect it just because it's hard. But just be conscious of what your available information is and whether or not you want to collect that or not. And similarly, like there are certain antenatal complications that may not be relevant to what you're looking at. So don't make it, don't go through an entire chart looking for that information. As far as basic neonatal outcomes, at the very least, you want to collect fetal sex, birth weight, gestational age at delivery, 5-minute APGAR if that's available. I would say that's probably the least important of those. Things to be conscious of. So, intensive care admission, that's great and often used as a marker of neonatal morbidity. It's great for single institution studies, important for multi-institution studies to realize that criteria for NICU admission varies by institution. And so some places have more kind of level of care on a mother-baby unit and some don't. And so just being aware of that limitation if you're combining data across institutions. And that's why instead of, if you are looking at like neonatal morbidity rather than looking at ICN admission alone, actually looking at things like respiratory needs. They needed CPAP, they needed intubation, they needed feeding assistance. That is a better way to quantify actual morbidity than ICN admission, where it could just be, again, an institutional dependent thing. Everyone under 35 weeks is admitted to the ICN in one place, and that's not true in another. The code book is where you can see sort of all your variables and what the numbers mean. This is important for when you're downloading the data as numbers, so you know what the numbers mean. And then a lot of additional features that I'll go into if we have time. So you can designate something as repeat instruments. So if someone may or may not have repeat values, for example, cervical length, you might have 1, you might have 3, hard to say, you might have 7, right? So I don't know how many cervical length values I might have for any person. So you can make your cervical length instrument repeatable. So everything's collected once, demographic, pregnancy history, and delivery outcomes are their own individual instruments. And then cervical length is a repeat instrument where you have the date of the ultrasound and the cervical length. So that's a great example of what a repeat instrument might become in handy. Another one would be blood pressure. You don't know how many blood pressure values you might have for someone, or glucose monitoring if you don't know. If you do know, if you know, like I'm checking this at 3 points in pregnancy, I'm going to have these 3 points, then don't make it a repeat instrument, make it a longitudinal study. But that's when a repeat instrument can come in handy. For auto numbering, I generally do auto number records. There are certain situations where you may want to manually number records, but in general, I recommend auto numbering it. Scheduling module is longitudinal. I'll go into that, but basically it allows you to say this visit should be 2 to 4 weeks after the prior visit. It's pretty specific. You may or may not need it. RADCAP does have a randomization module, and it allows you to basically select, and if you want to randomize by specific strata, you would be able to select for that. So in your screening form, you would say, yes, they meet all these criteria. You would say this, I'm stratifying by study site or something. So in your screening form, the study site is a variable, and the next page you randomize. In order to develop a randomization model, basically, there is a randomization template that needs to be uploaded into RADCAP. I usually have our biostat department do this for us. They do it for either free or a limited cost. But the point is, like, you shouldn't be doing it, right? You can't create a randomization sequence that you have access to and then upload. So it should be done by someone external. If I'm not part of your study, I can also do this for you. It's not hard. It's just, again, the point is that you as the investigator cannot have access to randomization. So if I am not in your study in any way, then I can be the one to do it, but no one within the study should be doing this. You can also designate if you want certain fields to be emailed. So if you're enrolling people in a study, or you're planning to do like email surveys out, then you would create a RADCAP database. You'd upload all these emails into your RADCAP database and then send those out. Repeat instruments, again, so this is how if you select that option for repeat instrument, again, you have to select that in your design. Then you would say, which of these do you want to be a repeat instrument? And when you in order to add a new instance, so in that instrument, so if you go to like, let's say it was cervical length, if you were done, you would say done. If you have another one, you would say add new instance. Longitudinal data. So I'm going to show you how, I'm just going to go to RedCap to show you how to do this. But basically, if you're doing longitudinal design, you have multiple arms. And so this is my IV iron trial. So I have a screening arm and then a study arm. So they were screened in or out, and then they were designated in arm 1 or arm 2 based on randomization. And then these are my events. So, baseline, follow-up, and delivery. And then this is how you, in your design, you would say, well, these are the data points I want to collect at baseline. These are the things that are going collected each visit. So again, here, this is like the alternative to doing a repeat instrument, because I know I'm collecting CBC at baseline 30, 60, 90 days. I'm going to designate that as a repeat, as a longitudinal design with the instrument each time, rather than that individual thing as a repeat instrument. And then always test before launch. You should test it yourself, and then have someone else test it, because you know what you mean when you wrote a question or designed a field, and someone else might not. And so strongly recommend this for random sample patients. That will get deleted when you move to production, so that's fine. There is a quality check section, so it's data quality, and this is another check. So in your initial variable design, we talked about being able to do validation to make sure that data is entered properly. You can also do these quality checks where you can say gestational age at delivery should not be less than 20 or greater than 40, something like that. Age should not be this or that. Delivery date can't be delivery date cannot be before the consent date, things like that. Things that would be incorrect or not possible at all. And you can do that. And again, it's a way to make sure that you're not downloading and working with data. And I've done this so many times, like I had latency to delivery for one patient was a negative number because the dates had been entered inversely. And so I did all this analysis, and then when I looked at it, I realized that one number was wrong. And so then I had to repeat everything after correcting it. So for example, there's certain things can't be less than 0, things like that. And it really helps save you time. If you're doing a longitudinal study, the record status dashboard is a great way to see sort of where you are, who's completed follow-up 1, who's completed follow-up 2, how many times have you missed people, just to see. And then you can create reports. And again, this is a way where you can just look at specific output as you needed. This is helpful, for example, when you're doing your IRB renewal. Every year you need to submit the demographics of the participants enrolled. So you can create a report that's just the questions that IRB has, which is demographics, loss to follow-up, and study completion. And so then that way each year you're just running the report. You're not manually reviewing everything. So this is, again, like I said, this is an example of demographic reporting. And then let me just go through, I want to have time to, I'll go through how to create a report later. I just want to make sure that we have time. I just want to be able to go through RedCap with you. So let's open RedCap and we'll just go through all of these things. So let's see. This is still in, okay, so this is actually not completed yet. So we're going to use this. So this is for my planned clinical trial. And so this is, you can see what I've done. I've decided I'm using longitudinal data, so that's selected. And I have some repeat instruments and auto numbering, okay? The randomization module will be enabled, but this is still under design, so it's not there yet. So I've done this, selected this, then I go to online designer. That's the next step. So these are all my instruments that I've created. So let's take a look at, just for an example, like certain instruments. So here is demographic and OBGYN history. This is a calculated value. And so if you go over here, you can see this is how the value is being calculated. And if you want to go to, if you want to know how to do equations, if you go to how to format equations, basically this tells you like all the different things that you might want to do for calculation. So these are like the different mathematical fields that are available. These are like how you enter in information, how do you calculate, basically whatever thing that you want to calculate. There's date difference. It tells you like how to do different types of date comparisons. So you're not sort of working from scratch here. REDCap has a lot of guides, really easy to read guides where again they would just tell you like this is the format to use, and these are like fill in the blank here, date 1, comma, date 2, comma, etc. So that's calculated field. These are, you can see, so these are radio buttons, meaning like you can just pick one. This is race. This is a drop down field. Actually realizing this should be multiple choice, not a single thing that you can pick. And so this is a section header. So this is not like a real variable, but just splits up the field a little bit. And over here, I just want to show you something. So this is preterm pregnancy. And let's say over here, you have your variable name, you have your field type. This is the field label. So that's what the person sees entering data. And you can also put over here a field note. And that's to help someone know how to enter the data, better if you feel like that's helpful. So for over here, I have abortions, and over here I clarify or I specify as pregnancy loss or termination less than 20 weeks. Again, I think field notes are really helpful when you have other people entering your data. Yeah, this is copied from many studies I've done. So I often had medical students doing data entry, and so for either antenatal complications, OB history, I found it helpful to specify that so people knew what that meant. Like parity was total deliveries over 20 weeks, not just any, pregnancy. So things like that. So that's where the field note can come in handy. As you can see, these are all yes, no fields for social history. This is an example of check boxes. So over here, you can select multiple things. And here you can see the branching logic. So over here, substance use in pregnancy, yes or no. And so if you go to this design, sorry, wrong button. If you go to this green button, that's how you can define branching logic. Show field only if drug equals 1. And so same thing, like for example, for study consent, you could say show field only if like A equals 1, B equals 1, C equals 1, D equals 1, etc. And again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. You could do drag and drop, where basically you just say this, if this equals this equals that, etc. You don't have to create the code. You can just drag and drop what options you want to be true, and it will then create that syntax for you. So that's an example of instruments. This is study completion. I find this to be very important for prospective studies. Again, things that the IRB wants to know, and that you will be expected to report as well. So, okay, so we've designed all our instruments. Now let's go back to project setup. The next thing, once you've designed your instruments, is to, if you're doing a longitudinal study, define your events. So you might have enrollment, baseline, follow-up, 1, 2, 3, whatever it is that you want. And that's just, that's up to you. You can add new events. Those are pretty, straightforward. And here you can add arms. So you can have, for example, your one study arm, like for example, IV iron arm might have additional instruments based because they have 2 visits for IV iron, whereas your oral iron arm may not have that. So your arm, you would designate your instrument. You can designate your instruments by arm. You don't have to. And then once you have your events designed, then you'd go to designate instruments for my events. And so you can go to begin editing, and this is just simple checks. So at enrollment, I want to look at these things. Baseline, I want to look at these things. Whatever, these are the visits that I'm going to look at longitudinally. So that's where you can say which instruments you want to do when. And I want to say, even if you're not doing a prospective study, if you're doing something retrospective, but you are looking at these time points, like 12-week ultrasound, 20-week ultrasound, 32-week ultrasound delivery, that's another way that you can say, like, okay, at each ultrasound, I'm going to look at the AC or something, whatever it is that you're going to look at some criteria at each visit. You can do a longitudinal. It's not only for if you're doing prospective work. It just keeps you from having to, like I said, creating a new variable, CRU1, CRU2, CRU3. We're just doing that every time, instead of doing that, you can just do this designated instruments. It also helps in your data analysis because it's basically like the way you download it, it comes out as all distinct variables. It'll be like baseline visit, these like study ID 1 baseline visit, study ID 1 visit 1, study ID 1 visit 2, and it changes how you can, it gives you a little bit more flexibility in how you can analyze the data and create graphs, etc. Because then the visit itself is a variable that you can use in your analysis. So that's how you do the project setup for a longitudinal set. This one doesn't have repeat instruments, and so I didn't. Actually, this one does have repeat instruments. And for me, the repeat instruments that I had here are serum samples, because I didn't know if I would have one or multiple, for example, blood draws for that participant. And so you can see that the repeat instruments I've selected are there. And you can, do whatever you want as far as selecting repeat instruments.
For the repeat instruments, like when the person is like entering the data, is there like a button that says?
Yeah,
how it comes
that's
up?
exactly right. So let me go to, I have to go to one active project to show you. Let me think. So for example, over here, this is the repeat instrument, and you can see this plus sign that lets me create a new instrument. So here, this is my, serum sample. Like I said, I didn't know if I would have multiple samples or not. And so this is current instance, that was only one. So I didn't have multiple samples for that visit. If I did get multiple samples, I would say add new, and that adds your new instance.
Got it.
So that's how you add a new one.
What if it's just like, I guess my question is like, let's say it's like ultrasound, for instance,
Mhm.
you wrote the ultrasounds that you're putting in, and instead of, could you just like select it as one variable, or would it have to be an entire, like, I guess my question is, instead of having it as multiple forms, like within the form, can you do that kind of select?
So it's usually the instrument itself.
The entire
Yeah, the
instrument.
entire instrument. And generally that's what you'd want, because you need to have other data, right? Like that's that way, for example, like let's say you're following EFW.
Yeah.
Because you want to know the gestation, you want to know the date of the ultrasound, gestational age, and the EFW.
Got it.
Right? So
Yeah.
that's why you would have a repeat instrument. I think I had repeat instruments here. So let me see if oh no, you know what? This is before, so this is actually didn't have repeat instruments. This is when I designed a database and I didn't know about repeat instruments, or it didn't exist yet. But you can see how tedious this was. So I basically had to create a new field for every cervical length.
Right.
And the easier thing would have just have a cervical length instrument that was a repeat.
Yeah, no, this is like so.
I think
awesome.
so. Let me look at, I think colors, just see an example of it. I think for colors I did have repeat. Let's see. Yeah, so cervical length screening here was a repeat instrument. And so this was just, this is what I designated as repeat instrument. If someone had multiple cervical lengths, you just do add new. And it's simple, like this is, it just had 3 fields: cervical length, date, gestational age, and millimeter.
That makes sense.
That way, so that's how I would do it. If you're doing ultrasound, I would just have like growth ultrasound as a
Right.
repeat instrument, and you really just need like date, gestational age, and whatever specific
Right.
measures you want to put in.
That's so much easier than what I ended up doing, which was like putting a drop down for how many it is, and then it would just like.
Oh, on a
It
bucket,
looks
yeah.
like a mess, like it looks,
It
it just
become-
looks
it-
so
it-
messy.
Right, and then just so you know what it looks like. So, okay, well, let's just finish with, project setup first. So let me just see if we went through everything. So, okay, so we talked about longitudinal, we talked about repeat instruments, we talked about randomization module. Now let me show you quickly what a survey might look like, because I just did this. Here we go. So I created this survey. I created this survey, and so I want you to see what it would look like for a survey. So this says use surveys in this project. Yes, auto numbering, great. And then let's go to our designer. So this was so you designate which field you want as a survey. So for example, maybe your one field is your demographic information, like let's say you're going to email a survey out to everyone who's diagnosed with gestational diabetes. So your first field is your information about the patient and their diagnosis and what kind of diabetes they have. Great. Then your second instrument would be the actual survey that you send out to the patient. So in this case, I didn't have, this is a survey that I have a link for and not something that I'm going to email out. So you could either have a survey where you designate an email field. So in your demographic information, you then have the patient email, you designate an email field, and you can say, okay, I'm going to send out emails, and basically you have to you say who it's from, and then in your two, you would designate what your field is. I don't have an email field set up, so I can't do that for this survey. But that's two things to realize, that you can either do a survey that you have a link for, and then you just, and so that would be good if you're posting something like on Facebook, or you're emailing out the department, and rather than individually emailing someone their own survey link, you say, just go to this link and fill out this survey. So this is the actual survey form. And so here you can see these are the survey settings. Survey is active. This is the title. This is the instruction. So if someone goes to the survey, this is what they will see. You can, like I said, you can choose a lot of things. This gives you a printout of what your survey will look like. And then there's a lot of things that you can, a lot of options that there are allowed in surveys. You can or cannot have the option to download the survey. That's up to you if you want to do that or not. Survey specific email invitation field. So I don't have this. I didn't activate this on my survey, but if you were emailing out patients, one of your fields would be the patient's email address, which is in Epic. And then you would say, this is the email field that should be sent to. There, you can do things like, if someone completes the only fully completed surveys will be included, and anything partial will not be included, or everything will be, set up. So the response limit, so you can say, again, like you can include thank you or partial or not at all, etc. You can expire. So if something is time sensitive and after a certain date, you no longer want someone to be able to complete the survey, you can put that in. You can or cannot allow for save and return later. Again, this is just depending on what you want. For example, if you want something where you don't want someone to be able to go back, get additional information and come back to the survey, for example, then you would say can't complete later. You want to be able to know what someone does immediately, and if they don't complete it, they don't complete it. So those are things. So those are all options. You can, after someone's survey is complete, you can redirect them to a site. So if you have a research site or a patient information site that you want to direct them to, you can, after they complete the survey, they can go there, or you just have a thank you at the end. So, and then you can send yourself an email that or not, every time email is sent, you can decide, whether you want to get an email, whether you want them to get an email about that, etc. So those are all, that's a very brief, you could take an entire course on making a survey on REDCap, but those are some of the very brief kind of overview. I do want to highlight that REDCap has a lot of very simple tutorials for basically each thing, where it's like anywhere from 4 to 10 minutes of how do you do this? And if you haven't used RedCap before, I strongly recommend doing that. It will save you a lot of grief down the line and really helps you optimize, what you're doing. Like I said, there's e-consent options. If you're interested in using e-consent, just reach out to me specifically. Jefferson, IRB, RedCap along with Jefferson has created a consent template that they want you to use. And so if that's what you want to do, just let me know and I'll help connect you to, with doing that. It's a great option. I will say I've had I think it's a good option to have, and I haven't used it since COVID, but I did have a couple of cases where I was on an iPad doing it in the room with a patient, and because it wasn't the Wi-Fi connectivity went out or whatever, it didn't save. And so then I got kind of screwed. Later I realized I know I did this, I personally did it with the patient, but it didn't save. And so it is something that you do want to be aware. You can have technical issues. You want to make sure that you still print, even if you collect it, you should print it, right? If you collect it electronically, still print it out, right? Then and there, because you can have issues with electronic servers can be hacked. We can lose it altogether. Something can be corrupt. So if you're doing electronic consent, you still need to print it and have a paper copy of it. It's 11:30. I don't want to eat into Tanvi's time too much. Is there any RedCap specific questions you want me to go through? Okay, the last thing I do want to just go through quickly is data export. So you can export your data. And so you can go to export data. And the reason I bring this up is if you know what software you're using, export the data in the format of that software, because that will pull in, you have your variable name, which is like PT, and then you have the label, which is preterm, right? You have your coding, which is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the actual meaning, which is Black, white, Hispanic, etc. If you do this, where you download the data, export it for your specific software, it pulls in all those labels. So you don't have to go back and remember what means what. It will automatically have that. So when you display your data, although the software is using the numerical values, when it's displaying it for you, it'll use the label. So you're not guessing what variables means, you're not guessing what 1 versus 0 means, etc. So highly recommend that. If you are sharing it for someone else to use, generally you want to download the raw data. No statistical software can do an analysis with your data labels. So it can't compare Black versus white versus Asian, but it can compare 1 versus 2 versus 3. So that's an important thing with data export. And over here is where you can decide whether you want to remove identifying fields or not. The other thing that I want to highlight is you can select what you can create reports here. So if I want to create a report, you create the name, you can select which instruments you want to include your report or not. And you can select who you want to include. So you can say, I only want to select one cases, let's say I'm doing an analysis, I only want to select the ones where this is complete. Okay, I don't want any incomplete ones. So you can create a report with just the ones that are complete. Or just the ones I only want to look at my pre-term delivery. So you make it feel like I only export the data for delivery at less gestational age under 37 weeks. Whatever it is that you want. It's a really great way to organize your data and select what you want to export. And then again, this is also what I use for IRB, where I select my study completion instrument. Usually this is the survey data, but my demographic instrument and my study completion instrument, just to have that easily available. And then finally, quickly, you can also do a data import tool. So let's say, for example, your database, you have MRN, age, date of birth, date of EDD, et cetera, and you did an Epic poll and you have all that information. You can then upload that into your database, and and I will show I'll help you do that. Basically, download your database form, you copy and paste your data into it, and then you upload it. Also a great way to save time for when you have a lot of data sort of in an Excel already that you need to upload into the database. We're running out of time here. So again, if you want to do that, just let me know. I'll help you do it. But, really great tool to use to save yourself time and avoid error, right? Anytime you're re-entering things, that's an opportunity for error. So if you have an Epic, and I've done this many times with an Epic poll, I upload it and basically their demographics are there, and then I'm going back and putting in the ultrasound information or whatever. And then the final thing, so user rights, this is where you can designate who has access to what. And then data quality, this is what I was talking about, where you can say whether some important things are missing, outliers, etc., and see if anyone's breaking, if you have any important missing data or incorrectly entered data. Okay, I'll hand it off to Tommy then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
App has like so many capabilities.
It does. It's hard. And you know, there's actually, I finally forgot to mention, there is, while she's pulling that up, Jefferson has a REDCap course, which I found, you know, I haven't looked recently. As of last year, they had a REDCap course. I think it was either in the summer or the fall, but I found it to be really helpful. I did it at the start of a study, and so basically used the course to help me
Make your
make my
database.
database. But it's a great tool, and it's a great tool to learn how to use so you don't do stupid things like I did.
Because there's so much.
There's so much. I mean, just like you could have an entire like course on surveys with REDCap,
Yeah.
to be honest, for example.
I want to share on Zoom. All right. Hi guys, I'm Tanvi. You know me. I'm a third year in Cincinnati. And this is my last week here. It's been awesome. So thank you guys all for working with me. I'm going to talk about hyponatremia in pregnancy. And this case was inspired by one of our patients that I saw my first week here. I did talk about her my first week if you were here during that time as well. But she was a 19-year-old G2P0010 at 32 and 2 who was basically sent in from her prenatal care appointment with syncope and was found to have a history that was consistent with hyperemesis gravidarum. She overall was surprisingly very well appearing, but really was just like spitting, but otherwise like looked very well for somebody who had the following really bad electrolyte derangements. She had a sodium of 118. She had hypokalemia to 2.1. She had a bad AKI with a creatinine of 2. She had a transaminitis and an anion gap that was present. Additionally, her urine studies, I actually found were kind of interesting in that she really only had 1+ ketones and just like a mildly elevated specific gravity. And I'll get back to the lights at the end of my presentation, but just to kind of keep these numbers in mind, her urine sodium was 50 and her chloride was less than 20. She also had a prolonged EKG QTC of 599, and her tracing, unsurprisingly, was category 2 with minimal variability. Overall, like I said, she was sent in for syncope, but this was the first time pretty much during her pregnancy that she ever came to triage. She had reported during her prenatal care visit some nausea and vomiting, but never really made it out to be as severe as it was, which she told us she was vomiting like up to like 5 to 9 times a day for like the majority of her pregnancy. And so, like I said, the inspiration for this pregnancy was, or for this presentation was that her sodium was 118, so this was an interesting management situation for us. Yeah, not my pregnancy. So just a quick reminder of the nephron from our good old medical school days. So if you remember, the nephron is the powerhouse of the kidney. We have our glomerulus, our proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule. Do I have access to? Oh, cool. the distal convoluted tubule, and our collecting duct here. And what's important, I just kind of wanted to highlight that in different parts of the nephron, you have different transporters that are doing different things with the electrolytes. So for instance, in the proximal convoluted tubule, you have sodium and chloride that are being reabsorbed, and potassium being reabsorbed, and bicarbonate being reabsorbed, but all of that's at the expense of like hydrogen ions that are being filtered back into the nephron. And then in other places, the transporters act in a different way, and that like sodium and potassium have opposite directionalities here, but then again, here they have similar directionalities as the proximal convoluted tubule. The ones to pay attention to just going forward are that sodium, potassium, and bicarbonate are usually reabsorbed at the expense of hydrogen. And here's like really the only place where they're done in opposite directions. So really bringing it back to basic physiology, what's the difference between osmolarity and osmolality? So osmolarity, this is more just because I couldn't get past like how all of these different like equations were having like units that were different. I was like, why does this, you know, this doesn't make sense to me. So osmolarity is the amount of like osmoles or stuff that is dissolved in 1 liter of solution. And if we remember back to high school chemistry, volume is dependent on temperature and pressure through 2 different laws, Charles' law and Boyle's law. And so as a result, osmolarity is dependent on temperature and pressure. To circumvent this, in the clinical world, we came up with the term osmolality, which is osmoles that are dissolved in 1 kilogram of solution. So that kind of takes away that independence from temperature and pressure. Luckily for us, plasma is mostly water, and so 1 liter of water is essentially equivalent to 1 kilogram of water, which allows us to kind of use these terms interchangeably. And throughout the literature and stuff, they pretty much use these terms interchangeably. So just in case you see them differently and wonder what they mean. So when we're calculating serum osmolality, or the amount of stuff that's in our blood, normally the value should be 275 to 290. And in most individuals, the things that are contributing to this osmolality are sodium salts, glucose, and urea. This is an equation that you can either calculate using things that you get from like your BMP, or you can actually send the lab itself just like a serum osmolality. I won't, just in the interest of time, I'll skip kind of like what goes into this equation, except just knowing that it's, again, the sodium anions with the associated like sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride. Those 2 is why the factor is multiplied by 2. And then versus if you calculate it just using findings from the BMP versus what you actually get just if you send the serum osmolality, there can be a gap. And if you see this gap, you should be thinking about things like, are there extra sugars in the blood? Like if you're doing a hysteroscopy with glycine, which you really don't do anymore, but if for some reason you were, or mannitol, and you see this osmolar gap, like that could be a reason why. Or if somebody ingested ethylene glycol and that's not, you know, accounted for in the calculated serum osmolality equation, so maybe they have something like that going on. Another big common cause is like hyperproteinemia. So for instance, like if you have like IVIG that's soluble, you know, immunoglobulins, like that can raise your osmolality, but not be accounted for in the calculated equation. So then moving on to tonicity, how is that different from osmolality? The difference is that tonicity is a relationship between 2 solutions across a membrane. And it's also known as the effective serum osmolality. The reason for this is that it really only accounts for the stuff in blood that is sensed by the osmoreceptors in the body. And the reason that these substances are sensed by the receptors is because they don't easily cross the cell membrane. And so instead they use osmosis to pull water in either direction, according to like which side of the cell membrane has more solutes in it. Things that do affect where water goes are things like sodium salts, sugars, soluble proteins. Things that don't affect water distribution are things like alcohol and urea, because those actually pretty easily distribute or equilibrate across the cell membrane. And insoluble things like lipids and certain proteins that don't dissolve in plasma. So now if we're moving on to classifying hyponatremia, what does it mean, first of all? So hyponatremia is a sodium that is less than 135. And again, kind of just skipping the units part because that was really me going into a really deep dive into why this was the way that it was. But you can classify hyponatremia also into acute versus chronic. Acute being less than 48 hours acute onset versus did it occur over a period of 48 hours or some unknown duration. You can also classify it based on severity. So is it asymptomatic versus symptomatic? Our patient, besides passing out, otherwise was pretty asymptomatic, but for the most part, you know, other people that vomit and come into triage look pretty terrible. She looked pretty good. You can also classify it just based on the absolute number into mild, moderate, or severe. So when you're evaluating hyponatremia, the first thing you want to do is make sure it's real. And this was like, ooh, it took me like an hour to make this make sense in my head. But I think I figured it out. So pseudohyponatremia, when we use this term, it is essentially a lab artifact that's caused by an incorrect assumption. So when you send a BMP to the lab, they're making this assumption that the amount of water that is like in this plasma is essentially the same as the actual plasma volume, because normally proteins and lipids are a very small component of it. I should say insoluble proteins and lipids are a very small component. So that equation holds true in that you can really make the assumption that the volume is equal to the amount of water. But where it breaks down is if you have something like familial hypercholesterolemia, or let's say you just gave, you have like multiple myeloma and you have elevated like immunoglobulins that are not soluble in blood. Suddenly the water volume is not equivalent to the total plasma volume. And so that's kind of where this breaks down. And in order to get the true value, like you take into account the clinical scenario to be suspicious of this in the first place. And then there's a separate like assay that you can send to the lab that will really just look at the plasma water specifically and what the concentration of the sodium is in that. So once you've confirmed that it's real, the next thing you want to do is look at the serum tonicity. And so hyponatremia is broken down into 3 types of tonicity, either hypotonic, in which the osmolality is less than 275, isotonic, where it's between our normal expected range, or it's hypertonic, in which it's greater than 290. I'll talk about hypotonic in a subsequent slide, just because it's got a full separate breakdown. Thankfully, isotonic and hypertonic have pretty limited differentials. So if you have an isotonic situation, really you want to be thinking about pseudohyponatremia like we just talked about. And for hypertonic hyponatremia, you want to be looking at, is the patient have like diabetes and are they hyperglycemic? We talked about the use of like surgery, hysteroscopies, that you are using non-conductive solutions like lysine, mannitol, things like that. And IVIG, because it is the IVIG is prepared in a solution that contains sugars like mannitol, sorbitol, things like that. This is the hypotonic situation is the most common though, so that's what I'll talk about in a second. So when we're, once we've established the tonicity of the hyponatremia, we want to get urine osmolality and lights, and then assess is the patient clinically volume down, neutral, or overloaded. In the interest of this being hypotonic hyponatremia being the most common source of hyponatremia, we get the urine lights and we see that there are 2 options. It's either less than 100 or it's greater than 100. Low urine osmolality is associated with only like a few differentials. Primary polydipsia, which is when you're usually in psych patients that are just like drinking a ton of water, free water. And so they just become low that way. There's also beer potomania and tea and toast diet. Again, kind of keywords from med school here, but really what you're doing is you're just not intaking a lot of solutes. It's just truly like the liquids. And so as a result, you're not really expelling any solutes into the urine. Or just renal insufficiency, your kidneys aren't working properly. And so it's not able to secrete water and solutes into the tubule as necessary. Now, if you have a high urine osmolality, some things you want to be looking for next are what's the effective arterial blood volume, which is the EABV. Is it low or is it normal? If it's low, now what's the extracellular fluid? Is that also low or is it high, like in things like heart failure, cirrhosis, nephrotic syndrome, versus is it low in situations like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea? Versus if it's normal, some things you want to be thinking of, this is kind of like you've gone down the whole pathway and this is your diagnoses of exclusion, things like reset osmostat, SIADH, cortisol deficiency, or if the patient's on a thiazide, that can lead to this situation as well. So I kind of wanted to tailor this to pregnancy, obviously. So 5 important etiologies of hyponatremia in pregnancy. The first being reset osmostat. which I found this really interesting and something new that I learned was that in pregnancy, actually, the body kind of has a new set point where the osmolality becomes 270 and the sodium decreases by about 4 to 5 milliequivalents per liter just normally. And the body reacts to that as like its new set point. So really in pregnancy, unless your sodium is less than 130, you know, you can be reassured by that. Once it's less than 130, you really should be looking for some other cause. And this set point is thought to be affected by a hormone called relaxin, which is still poorly understood exactly how it affects the set point, but this hormone is mediated by HCG production during pregnancy. So that's kind of how it got discovered in the first place. Secondly, probably like one of our most common causes and the cause in our situation was GI distress. So this usually leads to hypotonic hyponatremia. First one being vomiting, including hyperemesis. And so we know that hyperemesis causes a hypochloremic metabolic alkalosis. So bear with me here as I go through the electrolytes and why this happens, but it actually makes a lot of sense. So as we know, most patients in pregnancy vomit, and hyperemesis, though, thankfully only affects a very small amount of pregnancies. When we get urine lights, it is very common to see a urine sodium that is greater than 40, but even more specific is that there will be a low urine chloride. The reason for this is that your body is trying to reabsorb chloride because when you're vomiting up stomach acid, which is hydrogen chloride. So you're trying to reabsorb chloride, which is why this is consistently low. This urine sodium is usually high because if you like look back here, when you're trying to get rid of bicarbonate, which you're trying to do in a metabolic alkalotic state, if you're getting rid of it, so it's going this way, then you have to do that at the expense of reabsorbing oh, sorry, I think I said that wrong. If this is where it breaks down. If you are trying to reabsorb, if you're trying to reabsorb stomach acid, sorry, if you're trying to reabsorb this way, then as a result, you are dumping bicarbonate into, you're also dumping bicarbonate into the urine as well. And it's just basically with the way that transporters work that you end up with this electrolyte profile. Diarrhea, on the other hand, typically causes a metabolic acidosis. And so kind of same thing here. In this situation, you are trying to dump the hydrogen chloride ions and you are in turn reabsorbing bicarbonate. And so you end up with a urine sodium of less than 25, which is pretty common. And again, you're trying to reabsorb volume as well. And so when sodium enters the body, water will follow. So that's why that electrolyte profile in the urine is common. Another common cause in pregnancy of hyponatremia is diabetic ketoacidosis. And this is actually a hypertonic hyponatremia. Again, if we look back at this formula, you have normally glucose being a pretty low contributor to the serum osmolality, but in the situation of DKA, we know that glucose is elevated, so that makes this whole factor elevated and in turn increases the serum osmolality. DKA occurs in about 0.5 to 3% of patients that do have pre-gestational diabetes. We know that it's more common in patients with type 1 than type 2. And that triggers for this can include things like infection, trauma, steroids, and vomiting. So especially with our like late preterm patients that we're thinking about giving steroids to, we should be careful about it if they have underlying pre-gestational diabetes. And in patients obviously that have hyperemesis, this is something that we want to be aware of. Interestingly though, I did not know this, but glucose levels in pregnant women actually tend to be lower at a lower level than expected for patients to trigger DKA. So they can be like even in like the 200s and still undergo DKA and not be in like the classically like 300-400s. And obviously, as we know, this is an obstetric emergency. It can lead to fetal hypoxemia and acidosis and maternal morbidity and mortality. So fixing the underlying cause is really important. Preeclampsia is also another really interesting etiology for hyponatremia. The thought is that this is a hypotonic hyponatremia, and the proposed mechanism is SIADH and nephrotic syndrome. The SIADH is a little poorly understood, but the nephrotic syndrome makes sense. We know that in preeclampsia, you're spilling protein, oftentimes more than 3 grams in a day. And so this can increase your risk that ADH is secreted to try and maintain your effective arterial blood volume. And so as a result, you'll get a lot of influx of free water and trigger the hyponatremia that way. Hyponatremia is actually, the frequency of this is increased in patients that meet criteria for severe features. And it actually can be an indication for delivery if you're having persistently low sodium levels. There were studies that demonstrated that patients were delivered for this reason. And it's been shown that there may be an association between hyponatremia and preeclampsia and increased risk of seizures, which I thought was interesting. Risk factors for hyponatremia in pregnant patients that have preeclampsia include nulliparity, advanced maternal age, and multifetal gestation. So that was also new to me. And then lastly, labor induction can cause a hypotonic hyponatremia. With our glorious use of Pitocin, sometimes we overdo it, and it can lead to SIADH because oxytocin and ADH are both secreted by the posterior pituitary. They both structurally are similar, and so the PIT can lead to an ADH analog type of effect and lead to just free water reabsorption and lead to hyponatremia. So going into the management of hyponatremia, basic tenets include for acute hyponatremia being aggressive because you want to prevent cerebral edema. For chronic, though, overly aggressive treatment can actually be the downfall and can lead to an increased risk for osmotic demyelination. And if we remember from first aid in med school, from high to low, your brain will blow, from low to high, your pons will die. So that's how I always remember which way we want to be more careful in treating. For the most part, if patients are being admitted for something severe like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and they have a severe hyponatremia, that's something that you definitely want to treat in the hospital. Also, if it's acute onset and if patients are symptomatic, you definitely want to be treating this in the hospital. So for acute hyponatremia, we basically want to restore the sodium back to normal as fast as possible so that you prevent cerebral edema. For asymptomatic patients, you want to give a 50 milliliter bolus of hypertonic saline, unless for some reason they already appear to be compensating for whatever source was triggering the hyponatremia. And you want to be checking labs every 1 to 2 hours and determine if additional treatment is necessary. For symptomatic patients, you just want to be a little bit more aggressive about how much hypertonic saline you're giving, but it's still a pretty low amount. Only 100 milliliters was the recommendation. But if patients are still symptomatic, despite that, you can repeat the dose of hypertonic saline a couple more times. And again, frequent lab checks are critical in this time period. Now, for chronic hyponatremia management, initially, for mild and moderate asymptomatic hyponatremia, free water restriction is important. So this is the one time where we don't want our patients to just say, keep drinking your water. Like I do. And there's actually
so much.
there's actually no need to give hypertonic saline in this situation.
This is how I treat it.
For moderate and severe symptomatic hyponatremia, it's actually similar to acute management or acute hyponatremia management, in that you want to give 100 milliliter bolus of hypertonic saline, and you can repeat it as needed to reach the goal of 4 to 6 milliequivalent increase. And again, frequent lab checks are key. And then for severe asymptomatic hyponatremia, which is what our patient was, we actually did a little bit different management, but it's okay because it ended up working out. But per up to date, the recommendation was to do hypertonic saline at a very slow infusion rate, or you could give boluses every 6 hours, but their preference was to do the slow infusion. And again, continuing to check labs frequently, especially with these asymptomatic patients, because you want to be more judicious. They may actually end up needing also concomitant DDAVP to just kind of be the brake to the acceleration with increase in sodium levels. So once you've kind of gotten them to their goal of like an increase in 4 to 6 milliequivalents per day, you don't need to go any more than that. It does not matter how low the starting sodium level is, because the risk of osmotic demyelination increases if you are overcorrecting in any capacity. You can also de-escalate lab monitoring once the initial kind of 4 to 6 milliequivalent increase is met, but until it's greater than 130, you really shouldn't be doing labs any less frequently than Q12 hours. So kind of after our first day, we switched to Q 4 to 6 hours, and then kind of with every day increase, we were decreasing lab monitoring further. Obviously, address any underlying etiologies for the hyponatremia. So for our patient, it was making sure that she had a good anti-emetic regimen that she was actually sticking to. Little less important for our patients, generally speaking, but fluid restriction. So again, not giving them the big jug of water that we normally give them. And then this is obviously where we would be getting our renal colleagues involved if we really felt like medications like loop diuretics, salt tablets, urea supplementation, DAVP, things like that, if that were necessary, our renal colleagues should definitely be involved. And then closely monitoring for osmotic demyelination syndrome. And so we know that osmotic demyelination syndrome is also referred to as central pontine myelinolysis. But what's important to know is that this does not always manifest right away, and it's actually a delayed presentation. So if you overcorrect, you might think you're out of the woods, but really the manifestations can occur 2 to 6 days after overcorrection. And so if we think about where the pons is in the brainstem, and so the brainstem mediates a lot of really important reflexes like swallowing, speech, consciousness. So obviously if you have a disruption in that, you're going to get symptoms that reflect that, such as like dysarthria, dysphagia, paralysis, altered consciousness, things like that. Severe cases can cause locked-in syndrome, in which your patient is awake but unable to move their extremities. They can only blink and move their eyelids, which is terrifying to think about. So our patient actually had a lot of risk factors for osmotic demyelination syndrome. She had a concurrent hypokalemia on presentation. Her potassium was 2.1. She was definitely malnourished, as what our nutrition colleagues did comment on. And thankfully her sodium was not less than 105, but we were still pretty low for her. So she had 2 risk factors for ODS.
And I just want to highlight, so the reason for the frequent sodium checks, like every few hours, is because you're not going to know. So the only way to prevent this is to have a slow compensation in your sodium, which you will only know by frequently checking those labs.
Yep. And then lastly, I just thought it was interesting that one of the case reports that I read actually talked about, actually multiple case reports, sorry, not just one, talked about the concomitant finding of Wernicke's and osmotic demyelination occurring in patients that were treated with hyperemesis gravidarum. And so giving thiamine management is also important, which is what we did for our patient. So just to kind of talk about how our patient was ultimately managed, we did get our renal colleagues involved from the start. And just like we talked about in this presentation, they wanted to be, while her underlying etiology was like kind of this like chronic dehydration, we still want to be judicious about how quickly we're giving IV fluids, and we want to restrict just absolute free water, so they can have like things like, Gatorade or, Boost drinks that have solutes in it, but just free water was what we wanted to restrict. We checked labs every 6 hours for the majority of the time, and then kind of the last day, once we got back to a normal range, spaced it out to Q12. And I actually thought we were like right on track with our goals and what we actually ended up with. So the first day, her goal, she started at 118. Our goal was 124 to 126. We were within a range of 121 to 126. Her day 2 goal was 130 to 132, and we were within the range of 130 to 134. And the 134 was like right at the end of her 24 hours. So it was acceptable. And her day 3 goal was 136 to 138. And that was exactly where we were. And her AKI resolved on that day as well.
And she just had, normal saline was her
Yes,
fluid.
normal saline, yeah. So
she did not,
yeah.
because she didn't have any of the severe features. She was not mentally, unstable. She wasn't out of it. And there was suspicion of it being chronic because of hyperemesis, not an acute thing that had happened to her.
Yep. Our renal colleagues also wanted us to check daily lights, and this kind of just proved the physiology that we talked about earlier. So as I mentioned, her day 0 urine lights were a sodium of 50, which we said was expected. It was expected to be greater than 40, and her chloride was less than 20, which was consistent with vomiting. On hospital day 1, her urine sodium decreased to less than 20, and her chloride also decreased to less than 20, which was consistent with like an acidosis picture that was resolving. We were no longer trying to frantically reabsorb the hydrogen ions. Day 2 is kind of an intermediate picture where we're still seeing improvement in volume status and acidosis. And then on the last day, when we had definitely like fully gotten back to a normal range of her sodium and her volume status was back to normal, that's when her urine sodium and chloride were kind of out of this classic vomiting light picture. We also got a cardiology consult just given her prolonged QTC, which they, as we expected, said was due to her electrolyte anomalies. So we had her getting daily EKGs and tele, and her QTC eventually normalized back down to from 599 to 456. we did get a nutrition consult. And so initially we had her on NPO, just to try and like get her fluids and kind of be in absolute control of what we were giving her. We then advanced her to clears and like full liquids. It took her a little bit of time because she was still nauseous and vomiting on that, but nutrition really wanted her to be back on a regular diet as soon as possible because they were saying that really she can't get the requirements that she needs unless she's on a regular diet. They also recommended that we do boost supplements just to improve her malnutrition state and to continue thiamine supplementation, which we had started on admission. We also were encouraged to check a phosphate daily to ensure that there was no refeeding syndrome. And interestingly, I didn't include the initial value, but she started off in like a very normal phosphate range of 4.5, I think is what it was. And then every day that we started giving her and feeding her, it went down very drastically, down to like 1.5. Yeah. So we were repleting her phos very aggressively throughout her admission.
What meds for nausea was she given?
She was, until her QTC improved, we really just did a scope patch and I think Tigan, yeah.
It wasn't actually hard. It was like just basic stuff though, like Raglan. Like she didn't need.
Yeah, she really didn't need a whole lot.
Kind of a weird. I mean, we talked about it.
Yeah, so that was kind of like the other thing, which their last recommendation was blind weights 1 to 2 twice a week because we were suspicious maybe a little bit. She did have her only medical history was anxiety. And so we were like, she's a 19-year-old with anxiety and newly pregnant. Like, could she have some component of an eating disorder? Because she really underplayed her symptoms a lot. So the recommendation as an outpatient too was to continue kind of 1 to 2 times weekly blind weights and addressing her psych things as an outpatient.
And she didn't have like it was pretty easy to advance her diet.
Yeah.
You know, that's what I mean. Like it wasn't like the hyperemesis where you're like trying 4 different meds before you get the nausea under control. It was like basically like the standard kind of first line therapies and then her nausea was better.
And one thing that was really interesting as well was that once, oh my God, I totally lost my train of thought. What was really interesting about what I was just gonna say? Never mind. It'll come back to me. Yeah, never mind.
Yeah, I think, so that was a really great presentation. I know we're past 12.
Yeah.
I think email that to Kavisha so she can distribute it because I loved most importantly, you had like the 4 common situations of hyponatremia in pregnancy and we see all of those. And
he was instrumental. He was instrumental in helping me with this presentation. So
a couple of things. So 1 is that, 2 is, there is a lower sodium in pregnancy. So our normal range is 130 to 135 and not 135 to 140. So if you like look on up to date outside of pregnancy, the numbers for severe, et cetera, it's not the same as in pregnancy. So if someone's sodium is 127, which is actually not uncommon if you look at your preeclamptics. You're not freaking out about it. Sure, put them on normal saline, but you're not like freaking out about it. I think if you're under 125, that's definitely like red flag, what's going on here. If it's 125 to 127, you think about those common scenarios, they generally won't need more than just normal saline. Under that, I think it's important to consult with renal about the best way to replete it. They might not need normal saline, but they might need to be in the ICU for tele and hourly labs, for example. So, even if it's the rare patient that needs hypertonic solution, but that doesn't mean they don't need ICU level care, which was something we had discussed with her that was, again, she was doing well. Her sodium had actually responded pretty quickly after a liter. She had just come in and got a bolus even before we found out that she was severely hyponatremic, right? And then the repeat.
Got P-light too.
Yeah, exactly. She got P-light. And then her sodium went from 118 to 122 or something. So she responded really well. And so there was not the thought that she needed to be in the ICU, but it was more just let's keep up with that fluids and that will slowly bring her sodium back up.
You were really lucky. The lab was actually really great at like drawing her labs on time. Sometimes at my hospital, like hammer text them to like, can you get your labs on time? But I think if they're able to reliably get labs on time, it was really essential.
And her baby looked like shit.
It really did.
It looked terrible. Until that acidosis resolved. It was like me.
Yeah. And then when Axel's 10 by 10, like 15 by 15s when it reached 32 weeks.
And then her outpatient plan was weekly labs, which have been fine. So initially we were doing weekly NSTs, but she's been doing well and it was hard for her to come for NST. So I said that was fine to stop doing that.
This is a really good.
Yeah, that was really good. Yeah.
But I will please send
I know
that.
it's a little heavy for electrolytes.
But it was a really, you did a really good flow. I loved that, so please send it.
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah,
has
just-
that.
Sometimes when I'm explaining, I'm like, wait, this makes sense in my head, and now how do I explain?
No, it was.
Okay, good.
One, I would think this one.
And I'll even like
Just
check.
did.
This one.
Yes, like.
I learned so much. I was like, back to renal. I was like, Nabi, can you please look at this? Like, I was like, I think I understand it, but I need you.
But then this one.
Dear. Yeah, he's literally in his renal block.
Oh, that's amazing.
Like when I told him I did this presentation, I was like, why didn't you just tell me? I would have like done your presentation for you.
This is the percent here. I think this is the wrong percent.
Forget how much you used to know.
You know what I mean?
And I was just like, wow, like
This
these
is
terms, like made
percent of
sense
people
to
with
me,
preterm
and like
birth
how,
that
why we
have
do what we
these.
do. I feel like renal is one of the few things where you really need to understand the physiology to like make the treatments make sense. Otherwise, a lot of other things, like you can just like get away with a superficial understanding for the most part, but like you can't know what you're doing unless you.
So these percentiles,
Understand.
do you know what I'm saying? This isn't 11 out of 25, this is 11 out of whatever.
You got lunch. Yeah, I did.
So the-
I can't, it's not like an additive thing.
So I think that, I
Didn't
think
look at
that,
it nice.
no, we just have to, and you just have to do, you just have to recap.
Oh, I will. What's
I
your
really love it.
You know, like this is just, this is
What's
giving,
that?
I accidentally did a percentage.
Actually, wait, I think I have it, because I think Moti sent something to all of us.
That's
So
true.
I have your.
Okay.
So the numbers, like these numbers are right, but the
The
percent
percentages,
is wrong,
okay,
yeah.
got it, thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you.
Oh, man. I am almost done with the manuscript and PowerPoint.
That's so exciting. I can double check it once you send it to me. I'll
Yeah,
double check
yeah,
those
yeah.
numbers, but I think that's okay. That would be my guess if you plug it in.
Yeah, I'm sure that was it. Thank you. And thanks again for doing that.